Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Dad's Slanting Politics. Good to see you again. We're going to cover a few things today. First of all, the big trade war between Canada and the US. And then we'll cover some of the latest moves by the Albanese Labor government, a slew of new laws and legislation passing the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the confusion in the One Nation camp around immigration numbers. And so, Freddie, it should be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, definitely. It should be. Oh, it's been a couple of weeks. And of course, as you know, lots has been happening. I think particularly a lot has been happening in Australian politics. And I don't know if you agree with that. There's been a lot of intricacy happening, a lot of debates on the news, lots of people getting involved. So my focus, at least, has shifted a lot more towards Australian politics than it has in the past. I think that it's become tiring almost to look at international politics because you get whiplash almost from the way it goes back and forth. And for the longevity of, the war in the Middle East, or in SWANA as you call it, and the tariff debate with Trump, you get a bit of whiplash. But we'll start off with that and everything that's happening with Canada and the US at the moment. If you wanted to give a quick rundown on it.
Sure, I agree with you. A lot of the stuff happening globally seems to be in a stalemate, the Iran war and all the Trump machinations, etc. The latest iteration of that is that the US and Canada were in trade negotiations, and Mark Carney is the world leader who, in my view, actually knows how to negotiate with Trump the best because he's tough. He's incredibly talented and smart because, as you may or may not know, not only is the Prime Minister of Canada, but he's been head of the Bank of England, head of the Bank of Canada, worked many years in Goldman Sachs. He's a super smart guy, used to be an ice hockey player, so he's also quite tough as well. And he just doesn't take any shit from Donald Trump. And so they were in negotiations, the Canadian representatives and the US. And at the last minute before the midnight deadline, Carney called his people and said, okay, we're out. We're not doing this because the US had pushed them and pushed them, even to the degree of, you might know that Canada's a bilingual country, French and English, and the US said they want to simplify their exports and only export, cereal packets with English on them and, questioning the whole bilingual nature of Canada. And that was one of the sticking points. And Carney fundamentally said, this is terribly bad for Canada. We can't agree with it. So Trump has now put on 25% tariff on all Canadian exports. Carney has responded saying now up to 50% tariffs and responded the same. So it could be potentially economically damaging for Canada. But right now, Carney's approval rating is through the roof with Canadians. I think he has 66% approval, one of the highest of any Western leaders. So this whole strategy of kowtowing to Trump is probably the wrong strategy. It'll be interesting how this plays out.
I mean, you could say there's a ton of political pluses happening here, right? There's so many different things to consider. There's the fact that he's appealing to the whole of Canada, including the Quebec portion of Canada, which obviously, as I'm sure a lot of you know, there are a lot of domestic disputes and concerns over whether Quebec should become separate and become its own country. So, that wins over some of the more radical people in that camp, hopefully, by him defending their right to French as also one of the registered national languages, and the disrespect shown by the US in not considering that in their exports. And also, that's flat out disrespect to the rest of the world when we consider it, and the forced nature of English as the natural lingua that people have to use across the world, regardless of the amount of people who speak it. But, that's nothing to be surprised by. And yeah, the fact that over time, people just become more and more frustrated by Trump. So again, Carney's winning on that. But I think that it is going to be devastating for Canada, regardless of how impressive it was that Carney stood up to Trump. And I think that he didn't really have a choice. Obviously, if the tariffs have been put on Canada, he needs to do reciprocal tariffs. I have seen that it's going to apply to 20 billion worth of exports. And the Canadian economy relies on the US in a massive way. The US has a lot of other trading partners. Those relationships have been damaged due to Trump's many, many trade wars that he has initiated. But, the US has a lot of options. Canada doesn't have as many. So we will see a big downswing economically in that area.
I think that the US trade negotiator was really shocked And Trump's now quoted on X, Canada's the most difficult country in the world to deal with. This is wonderful for Carney, right? Because Trump doesn't know how to deal, like any bully, he doesn't know how to deal with someone who says, okay, we don't agree. We're not playing this game. I actually think they'll come back and they'll negotiate a deal in the next 2 months, because this is too damaging, not only to Canada, but to all those borderland states, Michigan, etc., in the US. And by the way, all those states are very important in the midterms. So they'll be economically damaged big time. Already, Canadian tourism is through the floor in the US, and people are noticing it, right? They were one of the biggest groups of tourists to go to Canada. And another interesting article I read on this recently was, if Mark Carney was an American, he would be the number one candidate to be running the Democratic leadership going forward.
Where did you get that?
I was just reading it the other day, because he is so skilled with this. And the other candidates, the Newsoms of the world, when you think about it, they're skilled people, but they're nothing compared to Mark Carney, given his global experience
Yeah, definitely.
and such. So it's really, really fascinating to see where it ends. And I'm sure the rest of the world is waiting with bated breath, including the Europeans and the Australians and South Koreans, Japanese, to see how this plays out, because it might be a new play for them to deal with the US as well.
Well, definitely. And I think that Carney gave us a preview of this when he spoke at the World Munich Security. Was it the Munich Security
Security
Conference?
Conference, yeah.
I thought it was in Davos when he did his speech.
I'm sorry, no.
I think it was in
yes,
Davos
yes.
when he did his speech on how great power is now the new way of things, and therefore people have to step up to Trump in a might shows might type of way. And I think this is the first we've seen of that. Everyone else has been cowering down to him in a kind of typical fashion, expecting that Trump would go about, policy and foreign affairs in the normal way. But because he's broken rule after rule, you do get to the point where you just have to stand up to him and can't expect him to do traditional policy. So yeah, we've seen Carney do exactly what he said that he was going to do. And, maybe Trump is just far more words than he is action, especially when it comes to the international community. He's done a lot domestically. You can't say he hasn't. He has damaged people's livelihoods all across America. But when it comes to the international world, different leaders, they have a responsibility to stand up to them, and they can scare him into going back on his word, I think.
And the US buys more from Canada than almost any other country. And so this is going to add to inflation in the US, right? When you're putting a 50% tariff on all those goods. So yeah, it'll be really fascinating to see. It's exciting times from a political point of view, thanks
Exciting.
to Mark Carney.
Yeah, exciting.
So then if we move to the Australian situation, Albanese's been on somewhat of a roll because they got through a lot of legislation recently. The savings on the NDIS, and the background there was the NDIS is growing at such a rate that it's unsustainable. So
Just to be the devil's advocate for a second, I know that a lot of the funding issues are like incredibly problematic, right? Providers for the NDIS that charge ridiculous amounts, and it's
a
bad.
lot of corruption with it.
Yeah, and there's lots of corruption within it. But part of me, as the devil's advocate in me, part of me questions whether just cutting overall funding to it is doing the job that it needs to do, or whether it makes sense that the NDIS is growing. Like, to some extent, it makes sense that it's growing. There are lots of people in our society who have needs that need to be addressed by the NDIS framework. And we are more aware of how disability affects us now than we have been in the past. So to some extent, I think it makes sense that it's growing, but it just shouldn't be the price that it is. Like, it shouldn't be costing us what it is.
It's growing like crazy,
Yeah.
right? It's the economy can't afford it.
But no, but what I'm saying is the issue then is the providers.
Yeah, there's many complications within it, and the number of people in it, like the number of children, for example, who've been in the NDIS and they really shouldn't be. So the federal government is saying to all the states, hey, this is your responsibility. The NDIS has become the catch-all for everything.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, right? So of course they need to do it in a sensitive way, but I think it's good economic management that they can't have a huge spend by the government growing way faster than the economy, because it
Yeah.
will send the country broke.
No, and I do completely understand that. I think just part of me, because I'm not maybe as across the issue as I should be. And I'm happy to admit that. I'm always happy to admit that there's more that I could learn. I think sometimes I just worry that we are thinking, I don't know, we're very quick to just like cut social
Well,
welfare spending.
remember Labor initiated the NDIS. They
Yeah.
like it. They agree with the
Yeah.
concept of it. But all this stuff has to be well managed, right?
Yeah.
If it gets out of control, the fastest way to destroy the NDIS is allow it to continue to be out of control.
And then it gets to the
Because
point where
people
they
get
feel like they
pissed
need
off,
to get
people have
rid
to
of it
put
completely.
taxes up, and then everyone says, forget this.
No, I
don't want it.
understand that. But I don't know. Do you know a bit more about the specific cuts? Because I don't know too much.
Well, yes, fundamentally, they're taking more people out of the NDIS,
Mm.
like particularly younger people who should be
So is
managed
it
by New South, state
okay?
health
So is it
authorities.
complicating the like requirements of it? So when you apply, you need to have very specific reasons for
No, not
applying?
really. It's just a different method, and it's saying, for example, they're cutting down on corruption. They're
Mm.
doing lots of audits of the suppliers, but also, I mean, there have been scenarios with the NDIS where people take someone out to go to the beach for the day. Right now, I get that's desirable if somebody is disabled, etc.
Yeah.
But there's a limit to what society can provide for here, right? I mean, when you're having to take people out every day and spend money on a
But what's the point of
person.
Okay, again, devil's advocate. And I love saying that because it basically protects me from any retribution that you could throw at me. But devil's advocate, isn't the point of government to provide almost like you could say like a crutch to
Yes.
society as a whole? And, I have a grandma who needs help and we all work jobs. I do full-time uni. I have a job. My mum has full-time work. You do a lot of work as well. Like we're busy people and lots of people across the country have that type of situation. And then you have an individual in your family who needs full-time care. There aren't too many systems in place even now to look after people like that. And this is the same thing that applies to the NDIS. I'm just saying that I don't know if there's necessarily something wrong with someone who really needs better quality of life being taken to the beach for the day, as long as the providers aren't overcharging.
It's one of,
For the
but Freddie, it's
service.
one of the more generous programs in the world.
But what's wrong with that?
No, there's nothing wrong with
We
it.
can leave
There's nothing
the
wrong with it,
world.
but it has to be sustainable and it has to be
No, I
and it's not at the moment.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental problem.
All right.
Okay, it's still huge expense, and that's
Definitely,
right.
definitely.
So that was number one. Number two was gambling reform. And they've come under quite
have
a
a
lot
lot
of
to say on that.
criticism here because people wanted them to go further. From what I read, Albanese, and he's an astute politician, I think he's been worried about being too bold on this, even though personally I agree they should be more bold, because he's worried about the sporting clubs and he's worried about the media companies in terms of their revenue streams, right? And there's a strong lobby from those groups. So politically, I think that's what he's worried about.
Well, I have quite a bit to say on this. I just want to pull up the name. Oh yeah, her name's Peter Murphy, but I don't. About Peter Murphy's like
Yes.
2020. It was like win some, lose some more. That was like the name of her inquiry that she did, and I'm sure that a lot of you know about this, but she was a Labour MP. She unfortunately passed away after this report was put through, but it was very comprehensive. It established a transitional process, so to ban all gambling ads from TV, and it also took into account social media gambling ads, and over a period of 3 years to allow sporting companies and the sporting industry as a whole to find alternative forms of investment, and also provided routes for them to find those alternative forms of investment and assistance. So then the process wouldn't be so destructive to the sporting industry as a whole, because at the moment they're incredibly intertwined, the gambling and sporting industry. And that's obviously not a healthy thing for Australians in general. So, this was a Labor supported plan that was put forward only 2 years ago. And I think it's funny that now we're in a situation where the Coalition and Labor got together to pass legislation that a lot of Labor MPs opposed, Liberal MPs even.
Well, Labor MPs wanted to go further.
No, that's what I'm saying. So they opposed it. That's, I'm sure that you guys know, sometimes people want to go further, so then you have to oppose the entire bill, because otherwise the bill will go through. That's the nature of how these things work in Parliament. So yeah, even Liberal MPs were opposed to how little the reform was doing. So I think that we're in a strange situation. Yes, they did something, but it's barely anything. And if you look at it in comparison to the tobacco excise and everything that's been done on that, like, there's the capability to do a lot more about gambling reform. And I'm wondering why that decision
I
has
don't.
been made to not
Oh,
go
we'll
further.
get to the tobacco
We will.
so I think they've done much on that at all at this point.
No, I'm saying like tobacco, like advertisement in general.
Okay, yes,
Yeah.
advertising, right. So that was the second tranche. The third tranche was the tech companies will now have to pay Australian media companies for their content. So the Googles of the world and the Microsofts and the Facebooks, etc., they'll have to pay Australian content creators and media companies a fee for their content. Very good thing. And then the other compromise component, which he got a coalition support on, was the recent tax legislation on family trusts and trusts. When people die or get divorced, it was called the Widows Impact. It was screwing up that whole thing. So they've got rid of this. It's the Widows Clause of
In
these
what way was it screwing
testamentary
up the
trusts.
whole?
Because you were going to be paid that you have to pay the capital gains tax at the point you got divorced or the point your partner died, rather than when you sold the property. And it was not the intent of the law.
Okay.
It was just sort of an error in the way they did it, and the coalition supported that change. And what I find interesting at the moment, this shows you the power of the government at the moment. On some legislation, for example, that tax legislation, they partnered with the Greens. With this, they're partnering with the coalition. So they're being really effective getting through what they want.
Mm.
Okay. And it shows what a dominant position they're in the parliament.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, I think everyone knows that the supermajority Labor government is in a dominant position.
Which I don't
at the
mind.
moment.
I don't actually mind. I actually think governments can achieve more if they're in a dominant position. But I suppose my minor frustration is
I mean, you know that I disagree.
they should be a little more ambitious on this gambling reform and on taxing the gas exports.
But
etc.,
would you
etc.
say that the German government has not achieved much in Tea Party run government? They don't have just a dual party system. They've had many parties.
I don't think Germany's achieved much. No, I think
Not recently. I mean,
recent years haven't achieved
not
much at all.
recently, but at points like, okay,
No,
like holistically,
well, yeah, for a
since
long
they've
period
had
of
that
time.
system, I'm not necessarily, it's okay, it's all very well to say, like, separately over this 3-year period of time, they haven't achieved much. I'm looking at the system. I'm not looking at the past couple years and what's happening.
Look, I think both.
I'm looking at the systems as a whole. It is not a bad thing to have deliberation on policy. It means that better policy is
agree.
achieved.
So long as the deliberation doesn't go on forever and nothing gets achieved.
Yes, but if things that are getting achieved are gambling policy that is not as effective as it should be, maybe they need more opposition.
But remember, Freddie, the other thing I often think about is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? You can always aspire for the perfect thing and never achieve it, right? For example,
That's something that you have to accept when you're working in government, right? Yes, I understand that. But if you are capable of having a working government that can work together with constructive criticism, you could say, and peacefully coexist in that way and then have a good product, that's great.
No, I agree. I agree it's great. I agree. And I'm surprised Albo's not even more brave and ambitious. But I think he's thinking he's got One Nation, being very popular in terms of the polls. And, he's moving the ball forward the way he wants to. I'm sure he's thinking politically, I could go further on this, but is that going to piss off the One Nation voters more so that will impact the Labor vote?
I think that that's possibly his fatal mistake, because I'm sure you guys know, like, Australian politics, because we have a dual party system, as in most systems, people move more and more centrist in order to garner most of the votes. Because obviously, if you're here, you can get every vote on this side of the spectrum. And if you're on that side, you get every vote on the other side of the spectrum. So over time, you move in. So what has happened, that Labor has moved so far in that direction, then now lots of voters, lots of people I hear say that they feel Liberal and Labor are quite similar on some policies. We've seen that. We've seen the practical reality of that over the past few weeks, where the coalition and Labor has come together on many a bill and passed them together. So we're in a situation where it feels like they're agreeing on a lot, and it doesn't matter if those policies are good or bad, but you need somewhere else to direct your anger. So as a voter, if I vote for the Labor Party and they are working with the Liberals, I think to myself, what's the point of voting for either of them if the same outcome is going to happen? You need an alternative.
Go ahead, we'll continue.
Okay. You need
Just ignore it, Milton.
I will. You need an alternative to vote for. Otherwise, you're always going to have voter dissatisfaction, and they're not going to feel like they're achieving anything. And that's what's happening. We're in a situation where voters feel dissatisfied with both the Liberals and the Labor. They don't feel like they can do enough by switching their vote to the other. So what happens? You know the answer to that. No, what happens?
Well, I look for something else.
And what's the other thing?
Well, it's One Nation.
Exactly.
It's the Teals.
So I would say that Albo's biggest mistake is not taking as many risks as he needs to and not providing that alternative route for Australians to vote for. And that's why they're turning to One Nation. And that's why he is at risk for the next election.
Well, partially I agree and partially I disagree.
Partially.
Because
This is based on political science
for
information.
example,
Thank you very much.
is in support of the tax on the gas exports, interestingly. Right, so I don't see why you'd have an issue with getting that through, and the Cross Branch to Teals and David Pocock, etc., in favour of that. Your argument about the two parties, I just think the Liberal Party is totally irrelevant, the coalition. I mean, they're heading towards oblivion at the moment.
No, but that's exactly what I'm saying.
And I don't
as well.
I think the way to nullify extreme right-wing parties is for governments to achieve a great deal and to be seen to be doing things and improving the economy and improving people's lot in life. The more they do that, and I think the braver they are, the better. Now, I think they're achieving quite a bit in terms of legislative progress. You could always say they could do more, which I agree on the gas tax and being tougher on this anti-gambling scenario. But you can't say they haven't done anything. You can't say they haven't moved the ball forward.
I can say that people have different opinions. People are either end of the political spectrum, and if they can't express themselves, they get frustrated.
Yeah.
And I think that most of Australia is feeling that right now. I think they're almost in the minority. I think that people are disappointed because people are always going to be disappointed. And you know, Australians, we don't like to like the government. We like to switch back and forth. We like to change prime ministers a lot. We like to change policies a lot. We don't have respect for those institutions. And, you know, that's a very narrow way of putting it. But basically, the point of what I'm trying to say is that regardless of what they're doing, there's always going to be someone who doesn't like it. And if they can't express their anger and disappointment by voting for the Liberals, because the Liberals aren't even really an option anymore, then they have to vote for someone else.
Yeah.
And that someone else is going to be One Nation.
It'll be interesting, Freddie, to see how it plays out, because before Albo, the most successful Prime Minister and longest serving for a period of time after the whole Keating scenario was Howard, right? Rather boring, you know, a bit like Albo in a way, you know, achieved a great deal. But
also did a lot of terrible things as well.
Also achieved some good things as well.
Good things.
Okay, well, gun buyback and the GST.
Yeah, that was good. That was good. The gun buyback was good.
Was very significant.
Yeah.
Two things.
Yeah.
And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And moving to One Nation, that's been an interesting thing over the last week, because David Farley is their new MP for the seat of Farrer, which was the seat that Susan Lee, the former head of the Liberal Party, used to hold in southern New South Wales.
Mm-hmm.
Now, David Farley's a business guy, and he was on Insiders on Sunday and being questioned about the immigration policy. And interestingly, he talked about the net overseas migration, the NOM it's called, being 130,000, but that 130,000 didn't include these guest agricultural workers, and it didn't include these overseas students. So in fact, the One Nation number is closer to 230,000, which is actually rather similar to the Labor number on this immigration. So he got into all sorts of trouble with Pauline Hanson, and she insisted and said, no, the number is 130,000, which is kind of ridiculous, right? Because the fact is, he's a rather good guy, this David Farley. He actually seems rather honest and trustworthy, and he understands in that electorate how many overseas workers you need to pick the crops and do all this
Mhm.
stuff. So he's thinking about the economic reality of cutting immigration so drastically. But he's in great trouble now with Pauline Hanson, etc. And a little funny aside, he was in Parliament and he walked into the wrong room, which was a Liberal Party meeting, and they're all shocked, the Liberal Party people, and he made a gag to them because they're all shocked, not saying anything. He was in their room saying, "Oh, maybe I'd fit in here." So it was quite amusing.
Well, I feel like that's the most interesting phenomenon so far about One Nation and what they've been achieving. Because there's been a lot of One Nation candidates and, elected MPs like David, who have quite different policies and different political opinions on things, and they don't seem as united as you would expect. And I think that says something about, One Nation is obviously not as structured as the other main parties because it doesn't have a strong party machine as they do, because it has never been as successful as it is being right now. So maybe they don't have the processes in order to screen people and, insist on repeating the same policies and insisting on, a consistent media stance amongst the whole party, because that's what it feels like, that it's almost erratic. Like, people express how they feel in the moment and they don't know where they should be standing in a media way. And it
Yeah.
feels like Pauline Hanson is losing control of the party. It's like, what do they stand for other than not being the Liberals and not being Labour?
Well, it's fascinating. There was always talk that David Farley would only last for 6 months with One Nation. And, this raises those questions again, because again, one of the questions he was asked, are you comfortable with the fact that there's no good Muslims in Australia? And he was very uncomfortable trying to answer that, which is, Pauline's quote on that. So it'll be fascinating to see it going forward, because there has been quite a few missteps. In a way, that makes her more popular with people who are disaffected with government and are pissed off with their lives, and they just want to tear the thing down.
That doesn't make her more popular, like the inconsistency of her MPs.
Yeah, well, the inconsistency doesn't, but just, they gloss over this stuff by saying, they're all a bunch of idiots and nothing's working. And, do you see what I mean? That's why I
Yeah.
think, in a way, the coalition agreeing with the government on something actually is damaging to One Nation, because the parliament as it works is working without One Nation, right? They're compromising, they're agreeing, they're getting legislation through. That is a great antidote to a right-wing party, because a right-wing party does better when nothing works in government and people say this government simply doesn't work.
Yes, it works better when the right-wing party isn't working. I think specifically that, because when there's no legitimate right-wing party to vote for, then you have to vote for the more extremist
Mhm.
one, because people aren't going to vote for the left-wing one. They'll vote for the more radical one. I don't know if, hopefully, because I want the Liberal Party to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, because otherwise we're going to have a situation in which Labor doesn't have, like, opposition. Or I want some kind of opposition.
Check and balance.
Yeah, you need balance in politics. You just need balance. And I'm sure that all of you would agree with this. Whether you like either party or not, they need to be able to push against each other. Minor parties can be stronger, sure, but there needs to be that level of opposition in government. Yeah, I think that if the Liberal Party is stronger, sure, but I think that just because they're agreeing and conceding to things that Labor wants to put through, that doesn't necessarily give One Nation more power.
I know, but the traditional two major parties not always disagreeing with each other, but actually combining forces sometimes and getting stuff done is an example of the parliament working, because compromise
Yeah.
is important, right?
Yeah, I agree. I just think we're talking about two separate things. This is your reasoning for why you think One Nation is going to do worse.
Yes.
My reasoning is that because they're working together, then there's no alternative, and people are going to see Liberal and Labor as one big government entity that ignores everything that they care about, and One Nation is the one person who's putting forward policies that are the opposite of what Labor and Liberal are doing, and therefore becoming the one opposition party and therefore garnering a ton of the votes. So I think that this as an issue is outweighing whatever like whatever positivity that they're getting from working as a feasible government, because government shouldn't work like that. It shouldn't be both parties just agreeing on everything and putting everything
Well, they
through.
don't agree on everything. They just agreed on a few
They've been,
things.
yeah, but
They
they've been agreeing
compromised
on
their
a few things.
legislation. The coalition wanted this widows'
How much has
tax
that
fix.
happened?
Germany, those parties where there's multiple parties, that's huge issues of compromise, right? When you have
Yes.
lots of small parties.
Yes, of course, because they have less power. And it's actually a great situation because people are used to having to compromise more. And because they have less power, they don't need to, like, strong shoulder their way through everything. They actually agree to things that benefit the greater population
Yes.
rather than just benefiting that one party.
Anyway, time will tell how all this plays
Time
out.
will tell.
So lovely talking to you, Freddie, and
Yeah.
good talking to all of you. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.